If you've been on social media as a queer person for the past decade or so, you've probably noticed that the only thing gayer than being gay is arguing about who is allowed to call themselves gay on the internet. Okay, I'm obviously joking, as there is way more to the LGBTQIA+ experience than oppression and infighting, and I think it'd be super reductive to genuinely paint online squabbles as equivalent to an entire community's lived experiences. Queerness is about identity and acceptance and advocating for our right to exist, not intra-community discourse. That said, to some people, it is all about the discourse. A large amount of not just their online presence, but their mental bandwidth is spent on these discussions that are mostly limited to the internet. And on the off chance it spreads beyond the internet, it usually takes a different form. These intra-community LGBT debates have varied drastically in topic over the years, but they never stop being inane. Are bisexuals valid? Are pansexuals valid? Are pansexuals erasing the existence of trans people? Who has it worse, trans femmes or trans masks? Gay men or lesbians? AMABs or AFABs? Should intersex be part of the acronym? Should intersex be part of the progress flag? Is the progress flag good? Which community should be allowed to use which flags? Who is allowed to say the Q word, the D word, the F word, the T word, the L word? Wait, no, that's a real show. And a documentary. Lesbians who live in Los Angeles are a danger. That's not a discourse, by the way, that's a fact. However, there's one discourse in particular that's basically ground zero for intra-community LGBTQ debates that swept late 2010s Twitter and Tumblr. I wouldn't say it's the first of these, but it's definitely one of the most prominent in certain online cultures, and one that every other inane discourse since has pretty much copied to a T. I'm talking about ace discourse, a term that should instill fear in you if you are on Tumblr from around 2016 to 2019, because even if you didn't engage in it, you definitely knew of it, and God was it a bad fucking time. Ace discourse was a several-year-long Tumblr and Twitter phenomenon that began in 2016, where countless Tumblr and Twitter users began to argue over one big question: do asexuals and aromantics belong in the LGBT+ community? It may not seem like all that complicated of a question. In fact, the answer today is pretty agreed upon. Yes, the original acronym for the community was LGBT, but the most commonly used extension of the acronym is LGBTQIA, with the A being for asexual, and abbreviations like LGBTQ or LGBT+ or LGBTQ+ tend to include all of their remaining identities by virtue of being abbreviations. For the queer community of today, it's not much of a question. I'm just gonna say it now, asexuals do belong in the LGBT community. Why shouldn't they be? Seriously, why shouldn't they be? What were the questions that concerns people had to pull the validity of asexuality in the community into question all these years ago? Where did the threads of discontent originate? What did a usual discussion of asexual rights look like? It's difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of this movement, but the original questions it entailed are fairly well documented. For example, should asexuals be allowed access to resources provided by LGBT+ charities by sheer virtue of being asexual when someone can be cis and romantically attracted to those of the opposing gender and asexual? A cishet ace, if you will. Likewise, should asexuals be allowed to reclaim the word queer by sheer virtue of being asexual when that means a theoretical cishet ace could say it? Should asexuals be allowed to organize, to attend Pride, to enter gay bars, to join explicitly queer spaces? Should they be allowed to say trans fat die? What? I just said travel fuzzy dice. The overall question was less, do asexuals and aromantics belong in the community, and more, do asexuals and aromantics belong in the community inherently when there are people under those umbrellas who are not L, G, B, or T? And the thing is, I can actually empathize with this question. If someone were to come up to me and say, I don't know, furries are a part of the LGBT+ community. Not like the community contains furries, that's a fact, but that being a furry inherently makes you LGBT. That the full acronym is now LGBTQIAP2F with the F standing for furry. That a cis and heterosexual man who wants to fuck Judy Hopps is allowed to call himself a queer and get an LGBT+ scholarship. If someone were to say all that, I'd probably be like, no. Like, yes, the furry fandom is often a target of harassment for their deviant sexual preferences. Conservatives love to use the existence of kids identifying as cats as a slippery slope scapegoat against trans people. In general, people are just really mean and aggressive to furries for no reason and act like they're inherently zoophiles or fucked up shit like that. I don't doubt that the furry community has had struggles, many of which overlap with the LGBT+ community, but I wouldn't say that makes one an inherent part of the LGBT+ community either. One community is a collection of people who are viewed as deviant by society because of our relations to sex and gender in ways that materially affect our health, safety, and lifestyle, and one is, for the most part, just a fandom. Something that is okay and should be allowed and shouldn't be bullied, and it's really bad when it is bullied, but at least in this specific case, isn't intrinsic to one's survival and rights and isn't constantly in danger of being legislated out of existence. That's essentially the argument that an exclusionist would have had about asexuality, that there is overlap between the ace community and the LGBT community, both in the amount of people who are asexual and LGBT, and in some of our struggles and terminology being similar, but that doesn't make asexuality inherently queer. You can be a cisgender man who is aromantic and doesn't want a relationship, but is heterosexual and enjoys having sex with women. How is that person oppressed? Why is this person allowed in a community with genuinely vulnerable individuals whose rights might be legislated away at a moment's notice? This is where I could see some nuance in the conversation. I do think it's important to acknowledge the varying levels of privilege that different members of the LGBT community might have. I'm a white trans woman that lives in Los Angeles. Despite everything, I'm in a pretty safe spot when it comes to accessing healthcare and gendered spaces in safe communities. The same would not be true if I were a black trans woman, or if I was a trans woman living in Florida, Missouri, or the United Kingdom. I think it'd be pretty tasteless to insert myself into discussions of black transness and act like my experiences are identical to theirs, because they're not. And the same would apply if some theoretical cishet ace positioned themselves as a monolithic voice of the trans community, or a straight furry tried to downplay homophobia with the excuse that they experience the same level of hatred for their fandom opinions. If this were happening on a wide scale, I do think it'd be something worth discussing, not in the matter of asexuals don't belong, but in the matter of equating all forms of oppression to each other serves to erase specific experiences of marginalized individuals in favor of painting a group as a whitewashed, marketable monolith. And that's just if this were happening on a wider scale. As we'll soon see, not much of this specific discussion was actually about cishet aces. See, the concept of a split attraction model is somewhat contentious in general. The idea that romantic and sexual attraction are different does make sense. Many asexual people do seek out romantic partners, and many aromantic people do have sex. A man who wants to date other men but isn't interested in sex could be called an asexual homoromantic or gay ace. In terms of figuring out one's identity, it can be a pretty useful way of looking at things, but you can also tell how this model can lead to an anti-cishet ace viewpoint. If you're saying that everyone in this model belongs in the LGBT+ community except for cisgender heteromantic heterosexuals, when someone is only missing one of the three, it's like you got a low score in a video game. You're one oppressed. You need to be at least 2 or 3 oppressed to qualify for the F word. It's a simplification that I honestly think removes a lot of nuance. It doesn't exactly take a scholar to notice that the patriarchal society that we live in, or at least the one that the evangelical right likes to push for, generally thinks that women should be sexually available to men, and men should be making babies and becoming daddies with women. Thus, homosexuality is bad because women are not sexually available to men, and men are not making babies and becoming daddies. If you are a woman who is not attracted to men, too bad, you have to be available to men. Your sexual needs have to be secondary to his. If you try to be deviant, we will socially ostracize you, which makes finding like-minded people difficult. We will not give you healthcare that accounts for your sexual needs. We will put you through conversion therapy. We will detrimentally affect your physical and mental well-being by all means possible if you're not sexually attracted to men. Again, this isn't rocket science, right? This is like feminism and sexual orientation 101. However, you know who's not sexually attracted to men? Lesbians. You know who else isn't sexually attracted to men? Asexual women of any romantic orientation. In that respect, lesbians and asexual women are often in the same boat. Yes, an asexual woman in a romantic relationship with a man isn't at risk of being hate crimed in the street the same way that a butch woman or two women holding hands might be, but that's not the sole arbiter of oppression. Does a single femme lesbian stop being quote-unquote oppressed because she doesn't openly appear LGBT? No. She's still going to have to reject advances from men who believe her to be a sexual object by virtue of her gender. She's still going to need access to feminine care that reflects her sexual needs as opposed to that of a woman who has sex with men. She's still going to need a communal safe space if she ever wants to meet other people like her to enter a relationship with, just like an asexual woman. A common retort to this type of argument would be that these struggles are real, but they're not asexual struggles. They're a phenomenon that all women go through. It's not aphobia, it's misogyny. It is true that the idea of women needing to be sexually available to men is born out of misogyny after all. This is something that a straight, sexually active woman who simply isn't attracted to every single man she meets would also go through. But 3 things. 1, a straight, sexually active woman will still have access to healthcare with the assumption that she is a straight, sexual woman. She would be able to find a male romantic and sexual partner without having to hide any part of herself at risk of violent retribution. Despite all of the misogyny that women go through, she is still going to have a quote-unquote advantage over those who can't be honest with their doctors about the type of sexual partners she does or does not have, or those who can't gather with people of the same sexuality to make connections in a healthy and accepting environment. 2, oppression is intersectional, y'all. Just look outside. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. Stuff that materially impacts trans women the most still impacts cis women. Misogyny is bad for women, but the toxic masculinity that it spouts is also bad for men. Why divide these forms of hurt into strict lines of who doesn't and doesn't fit when we are greater together than we are apart? This is what the LGBT community is about: organizing, creating spaces for us, normalizing our needs, rejecting the idea that our method of attraction is wrong because it doesn't match up with conservative values. When you try to exclude vulnerable groups under the guise of protecting people in the LGBT community, you are directly going against these principles in a way that does materially hurt people. And 3, asexual people are vulnerable. All of my arguments so far have been purely rhetorical because the arguments around ace discourse were also purely rhetorical. Going through some of the most shared exclusionist blogs and posts, it was so rare to find genuine good faith sources, which is insane considering these were entire blogs and posts dedicated to this political viewpoint. It wasn't about facts for these people, it was just vibes. And sure, I understand the vibe that someone who is cis and straight and doesn't have sex isn't as oppressed as your average drag queen, but that doesn't stop it from just being a vibe. Anytime sources were brought up in these discussions, they'd either be ignored or cycled back into the "this is just a different form of oppression" debate that immediately turns the conversation rhetorical again. So just for a moment, I'm gonna take a break from being rhetorical and look at the cold hard facts. Yes, aphobia can exist, obviously. Let's start off with a pretty big and obvious one. The Diagnostic Manual of Disorders, or DSM, used to list the lack of sexual attraction as a mental disorder, often diagnosing it as female sexual interest/arousal disorder for women and hypoactive sexual desire disorder for men. I say used to because in 2013, a note was added stating that those who self-identify as asexual may not qualify for this disorder, a move that was considered a half measure by some, but was welcomed nonetheless. From my non-medical perspective, I do think it makes sense for doctors to make a note when their patients lack sexual desire or libido, as those can be symptoms of other health issues, particularly in cases where the patient used to have those feelings. However, the idea that any persistent lack of sexual desire is because of a disorder and needs to be treated is still not good. Like, I see a lot of exclusionists argue that most doctors will simply back off if you specify that your lack of sexual activity comes from asexuality, and I can't overstate how naive that mindset is. diseases. In the very same 2013 update to the DSM, transgenderism was removed from the list of mental disorders, and has that stopped medical professionals from refusing to treat their trans patients correctly? No. There are many stories that I'll get to later of doctors refusing to believe the identity of asexual patients because of this exact precedent. A 2020 study with the University of Minnesota found that, out of 136 asexual people interviewed, nearly half of them have had doctors or therapists attribute asexuality to a health condition, with one respondent even being prescribed with a personality disorder because of it. To be fair, the DSM is mostly a US resource, and that 2020 study only spoke to US American residents. It's not difficult to find sources of systematic mistreatment in other countries as well, though. One major example is the United Kingdom. According to the UK government's 2018 National LGBT Survey, asexual people are 10% more likely to undergo conversion therapy than other sexualities. Yasmin Benoit and Robbie DeSantos of the LGBTQ organization Stonewall broke the survey results down further, mentioning stories of therapists refusing to give care for any topic beyond a client's sex drive, couples being denied in vitro fertilization due to their sexuality, gynecologist appointments being delayed by weeks due to an admitted lack of sexual activity, and one GP refusing to send a client to a gynecologist altogether until she agreed to go to psychosexual therapy, resulting in a 1.5-year delay before she could get the care she needed, which led to permanent muscular damage. To this you might say, sure, these are bad, but they're the normal amount of bad for the NHS. I would disagree. The NHS being bad doesn't excuse the specific form of bigotry being perpetrated, but if you want to find a systemic root to this issue, how about the fact that unlike the DSM, the International Classification of Diseases, or ISD, still categorizes the lack of sexual desire as a disorder? How about the fact that, also unlike the DSM, the ISD is used worldwide, including in countries like Russia, where in 2015, the Prime Minister signed a decree banning disabled people from driving. That is already horrible, of course. Many disabled people still have the full ability to drive, and this amendment went as far as to include gambling addicts and people shorter than 4'9". However, since the list of disabilities and disorders was based on the ISDs, the ban ended up including transgender people, bigender people, cross-dressers, transvestites, and yes, asexual people. Back to the US for a moment, in several states, such as Alaska, Connecticut, and Ohio, marriages that were not consummated have the grounds to be considered invalid, with Colorado, Delaware, Illinois, and a few others having similar but slightly less strict codes to my understanding. Such a clause can affect the outcome of not just divorce proceedings, but child custody and life insurance compensation upon one of the parties' death. A recent landmark case in Sweden saw this happen when the tragic death of an asexual woman's life partner led to a dispute over life insurance compensation with the woman's family. Under Swedish law, only couples that have consummated their relationship were considered valid, which the family tried to use to state claim over the insurance. Luckily, the Swedish court ruled in favor of the woman, setting an important legal precedent for the country. In the United States, this type of legal wording can be used against asexual couples in this type of relationship, though. This is all technically from above board medical institutions too. Once you get into shadier practices or how this can affect interpersonal relationships, things can get even worse. Content warning for talk of conversion therapy and sexual violence, by the way, timestamp on screen if you'd like to skip it. In 2023, the Trevor Project surveyed 28,000 LGBTQ people from ages 13 to 24 about their mental health and well-being amongst the US's fervent anti-LGBTQ atmosphere. Of the surveyed asexuals, 4% had experienced conversion therapy, which is the same percentage as bisexual youth, only 2% less than the amount experienced by gay, trans, and non-binary youths, and 4% more than any human being should experience. But Jenny, this study was from 2023. It was an entirely different conversation when this was going on back in 2017 to 19. Okay, in 2015, a volunteer-led project called the Asexual Census Summary Report surveyed 9,000 ace spectrum recipients scouted out from sources like Avon, the Asexual Agenda, and several asexual social media blogs. Of these 9,000 respondents, a stunning 41% had reported experiencing sexual violence, half of which came from the respondents' own intimate partners. But Jenny, the sexual violence comes from general misogyny and LGBT phobia, not aphobia specifically. Okay, let's do the non-misogynist thing and listen to what one of these women has to say about that. Julie Sandra Decker, author of the 2013 book The Invisible Orientation, has spoken about experiencing corrective assault at the age of 19. Specifically corrective assault because the man doing this to her was repeatedly harassing her about fixing and healing her lack of sexual attraction. She specifically talked about how the trauma of this experience has been downplayed by others, saying this happened because she's a woman, not because she's asexual, as if that erases the fact that her sexuality was used as a justification for her rape. Furthermore, some of the people who experience corrective assault aren't even women. This anonymous subject of a 2018 BuzzFeed article recounts his experience of non-consensual sex from a fellow man and how his experiences are often ignored. But Jenny, these are just random standalone stories, not a wider study of society that have been viewable during the days of ace discourse. Okay, here's a 2012 study by Brock University researchers where they surmise that many heterosexuals have just as dehumanizing a view of asexuals as they do homosexuals, a point that co-writer of the journal Gordon Hodson expanded upon in an article for Psychology Today.
Those disliking one social group also tend to dislike other social groups. In our recent paper, we found that those who dislike homosexuals also dislike bisexuals and asexuals. In other words, these prejudices are correlated. Heterosexuals who dislike one sexual minority, therefore, also dislike other sexual minorities, even though some of these groups are characterized by their sexual interest and activity, and others by their lack of sexual interest and activity. Contrary to conventional folk wisdom, prejudice against sexual minorities may not therefore have much to do with sexual activity at all. There is even evidence, for instance, that religious fundamentalists are prejudiced against homosexuals even when they are celibate. Together, such findings point to bias against others, especially different others, who are seen as substandard and deficient. Gordon Hodson, PhD.
I'm so tired, guys. I could be playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, but instead I'm producing this. If you're wondering why I'm going through so many condescending counterpoints that downplay all of this evidence, that's because a lot of exclusionists were making condescending counterpoints that downplay all of this evidence. If they didn't, there wouldn't be a ton of ground for exclusionists to stand on because of all the evidence. There wouldn't even be a video to make on this if people were perfectly reasonable in the face of studies and personal experiences of recounting genuine systemic discrimination, alienation, and violence. Discrimination is inherently irrational, whether it be heterosexuals viewing asexuals as machines, online queer people making asexual people out to be public enemy number one, or right-wing nutjobs spouting outrage and mockery over asexual identities. Because, big shocker, right-wing nutjobs also like to spout outrage and mockery of asexual identities. As far back as 2012, there's cases of Fox News hosts making fun of asexuality on air, comparing the group to lepers. More recently, in 2023, Yasmin Benoit, the aforementioned Stonewall activist, made this innocuous tweet about how asexual people deserve equal rights, legal recognition, and protection, with an attached picture of herself holding a pride flag. And it just got dozens upon dozens of replies, with hundreds upon thousands of likes each, completely belittling her with the most tired talking points. Holy crap, it's Megan Murphy from TERFs, it's Brianna Wu from Liberal Zionism, it's like a crossover of people I have blocked on Twitter. Benoit even went onto Newsmax to discuss some of the very same topics I did, to which the interviewer responded with the most condescending and insulting statements you can make. It's an absolute clusterfuck to watch.
So, you wrote this article that says, quote, "I'll never fall in love and that's okay. What it means to be aromantic. Don't you think you're missing out on a basic human connection here, though, to a certain extent?"
I have so many human connections. I have some incredibly deep long-term relationships. It doesn't have to be romantic to be a deep long-term relationship.
All of this leads one to wonder, what was Ace Discourse actually about? Why was 2010's Tumblr, the site stereotyped for being accepting of everything to the point where entire communities existed for the sole purpose of defining as many genders and sexualities as possible, suddenly so conflicted over asexuality? I get a fundy or a trans med causing a fuss, but this isn't the type of thing that most IRL queer spaces would usually debate, especially with all of this evidence that I just went over. If Ace Discourse in concept doesn't make sense, then what was Ace Discourse in execution? Nonsense. It was fucking nonsense! Hundreds upon hundreds of posts not discussing the differences in privilege between asexuals and other identities, not talking about the struggles that different LGBT groups go through, not arguing anything that would actually improve or materially affect queer spaces, but flippantly telling asexuals that no, you are not oppressed, you are invading LGBT spaces, you are in line with the current conservative evangelical right, you are speaking over LGBT people and their issues, you are accusing gay people of homophobia and trans people people of transphobia. Your struggles are not because of aphobia, but because of other forms of bigotry. You are allowed to have your own community, but that will not stop us from automatically grouping all discussions of asexuality into this discourse. The acronym is not LGBTQ+, it is LGBT. If you are not SGA/same gender attracted or trans, you do not belong in this community that has limited space and resources. You are discriminated against but not oppressed, it's technically different. Your headcanoning of characters as asexual borders on pedophilia. You cannot experience conversion therapy as an asexual person. Stop comparing this to biphobia. This is not like biphobia. Saying it is like biphobia is biphobic. Cishet aces are a lot like white Jews. What the fuck? So, it goes without saying that a lot of these are very dumb, both for the fundamental reasons I already discussed and others. I know I should probably stop giving these incoherent arguments from a half-decade-old discourse the time of day, but fuck it. I'd rather do it here now than in the comment section later. 1. Cishet aces and cishet arrows have not, are not, and never will be LGBT. So here's the thing. The acronym that the queer community uses has been in flux for decades, with LGBT itself reportedly not being coined until 1988. Contrary to popular belief, bisexual and transgender people were not always welcomed into the community with open arms. Right there on the first page of the book Bisexuality and Transgenderism, Jonathan Alexander and Karen Vescovage write,
"Many welcomed the expansion of the LGBT umbrella to cover bisexuals and the transgendered, who are often welcomed as queer brothers, sisters, and gender f***ers. Others, however, question whether bisexuals and the transgendered really belong in the lesbian and gay community, if they share common ground and common cause with lesbians and gays. The strangeness of the situation is certainly not lost on either bisexuals or the transgendered."
I only included this quote from the first page because the full book is really fucking expensive these days and not available at my local library, so obviously you're not going to find widespread inclusion of asexual people in an era where B's and T's barely skirted into the acronym, especially when asexual communities hadn't exactly formed in earnest until the age of the internet. The Asexuality Visibility and Education Network, or AVEN, was founded by David J. in 2001. Asexuals were first included at San Francisco Pride, the gayest event in the US, in 2009, and GLAAD formally recognized asexuality as an identity to be included among the LGBTs in 2015. This is fairly reminiscent of the gradual way in which bisexual and transgender people were eased into the community, because which sexual minorities are included in the community has always been in flux, thus making the arguments that one group always has or always has not been in the community not exactly definitive or all-encompassing. 2. Inclusionists are homophobic with how they single out gays. I see so many posts with this claim. Inclusionists are homophobic, lesbophobic, they say we shouldn't be at Pride, they compare trans people to TERFs. The interesting thing is, these posts that list off asexual crimes rarely include sources, or the thing they are referring to is an asexual or inclusionist angrily telling an exclusionist that they're being hypocritical, which leads to the pearl-clutching response of, how dare you compare us transgenders to the TERFs when trans people are being beaten in the streets. I'll get to that specific comparison later, but it is an encapsulation of how so much of this mindset was based on either making up a guy to get mad about, hyperbole, or just believing blatantly fake stories. We have this post about the supposed people who don't identify as ace outside of the discourse, followed by a rant about how this proves asexuals aren't actually oppressed. Who said the original quote? What is the context? Do they exist? Does this matter? Not to us. You have this super detailed, likely fake story about a supposed 11-year-old asexual that I'll get to in a moment. We have this putrid-ass post joking that maybe some of the cops at Stonewall were asexual, which was just kinda gauche. Now, I'm not gonna act like there weren't inclusionists being shitty too. It'd be unfair not to mention the trend of certain young asexual people joking about STDs or the AIDS crisis or talking about how gross they find the concept of gay sex, which is also bad. I don't condone that at all. People are fully in their right to be upset about these homophobic posts. The thing for me is that my co-writer and I went through a lot of tags and saw a lot of posts and gathered a lot of screenshots for this video. And we saw a lot more posts referring to these types of inclusionists than we actually saw posts from these exclusionists. I am not going to say that all of the posts referring to them are lying. Just because we couldn't find them doesn't mean they didn't exist. However, I do think the ratio of actual posts like this willingness to post getting angry about posts like this was completely disproportionate. There was a lot of assuming that all asexuals were guilty because of the worst posts from inclusionists, and while you could say the same attitude was present among inclusionists about exclusionists, one side is instigating this discourse against an entire group, that being asexuals as a whole, while the other side is put on the defensive against just exclusionists. Sorry, this is a late inclusion because I want to make it clear. I may be pro-asexuality, but I don't consider myself an inclusionist or an exclusionist because I am an adult who doesn't align myself with these online discourse terms and all the toxicity that comes with it. Back to the main subject. 3. You cannot call children asexual because prepubescent children cannot feel sexual attraction and should not have sex, and to call one asexual is to imply they can. Please God, in my suffering. Ugh, I hate this one and I hate talking about it, but it has to be said. Yes, prepubescent kids cannot experience sexual attraction. You can make the argument that they might know they like people of the same gender or that they identify with a different gender, but sex specifically is not something they should be partaking in. And I mean, yeah, duh. How old are we talking about when we say kids, though? Do we mean 5-year-olds? Or, like a lot of bad faith think of the children arguments we see about groups today, is kids being used as a general term to include anyone under the age of 18, including pubescent kids who are at a point where they're working through their hormones and what they like sexually. I've seen posts calling the mere association of asexuality and teenagers pedophilic, because they're teenagers. They're not supposed to be thinking about sex. Teenagers have never, ever thought about sex, guys. I know this is a very difficult topic to talk about, so I'm gonna use a specific post to illustrate my issues with this mindset. It's too long to read out, so I'm just gonna summarize it. OP says that an 11-year-old girl messaged them on DeviantArt asking for advice on if they're asexual. OP is understandably uncomfortable being double the user's age and wanting to work in education, where this kind of a conversation with a minor would be a bit of a no-no. They say, amongst other things, you are not asexual, you are 11. They do state that an 11-year-old shouldn't be giving any personal information like this publicly, which I fully agree with, but they also say that calling yourself asexual can trap you in this label, making it difficult to move beyond these labels and ideas. At first, the user listens to OP and removes the asexual flags from their page, only to add back even more the very next day. OP then moralizes about how painful it is to see a child using this label, how they're likely being validated by others and enabled by creeps into putting the flags back up, that letting a child talk about asexuality is forcing their relationship with sex to begin at an earlier age, how the supposed pressure to label oneself is inadvertently sexualizing children, and that the asexual community has a pedophilia problem. No, really, and I quote, "When I say the ace community has a pedophilia problem, I don't mean in the child porn sense. I mean it in the way it coercively sexualizes children by insisting on their capacity to be asexual, therefore insisting on children's capacity to be sexual as well." Yeah, a very loaded claim. Gonna be honest, my co-writer and I think this is a fake story because it's just so convenient to ace discourse in its presentation. This doe-eyed and misled child being corrupted by the asexual adults insisting that babies can be asexual, which means they think babies can be sexual, and they're basically Epstein for that. It feels like a very contrived response to claims that children can be asexual, as if kids are a monolith of one singular experience that lasts from ages 1 to 18. It's fully possible for someone starting puberty and experiencing hormones for the first time to feel confused about what they're going through, that they're not having crushes and they're feeling differently than their friends are. 11 is the youngest age I've seen in this type of discussion, and like OP, I don't feel comfortable commenting on a random child's sexuality. But I do think blaming the asexual community as a whole for a single prepubescent child ascribing a possibly incorrect label onto themselves is ridiculous, especially when we don't know the exact details of how they came to use that label. OP assumes it was some adult pushing it onto them, but they might have just stumbled upon it. Sometimes kids are going to learn about something at an age where they can't truly get it. If it was some adult coercing them, then fuck them, but we have zero evidence that that's the case. Even beyond the implication that merely telling children about sex is tantamount to pedophilia, an age-old conservative talking point that has been disproved by mountains of evidence that sex ed can actually save children from abuse. OP's entire thesis is that a teenager identifying as asexual is harming their ability to figure out their actual identity. Are there cases of people thinking they're asexual for a while, but that changing alongside their hormones? Yes. For example, there's me. I went through so many labels before I settled on who I was. Bi, male, to bi gender fluid, to bi trans, to trans lesbian, to bi trans again, but this time asexual, until I decided, nah, I'm not asexual, I just prefer the girl hormones over the boy hormones. Believe me, there's no $70 purchase I've gotten more value out of than my vibrator, and keep in mind that I already have 100 hours in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. My co-writer attests, though, that a lot of queer people have complicated journeys in discovering their sexuality. He went from cis bi girl to cis lesbian to non-binary bi girl to trans bi man to trans gay man, and even he feels more fluid in his sexuality than just pure gay, but still identifies as gay because it's his life and he can do what he wants. My point is, it's entirely normal to switch up your labels when you're trying to discover yourself. It should be encouraged, honestly, to not narrow yourself into one label and refuse to explore other possibilities. To act like asexuality is some exception to this rule is ludicrous. Some asexual people are going to discover that no, they actually do like sex, the same way that some people are going to live as another gender and discover, no, I actually like my assigned one. That's perfectly fine, but that should not be used as a gotcha against people who actually feel that way. The lengths that OP is willing to go in order to make simply telling children about asexuality into this huge moral issue, where if a single kid describes themselves as asexual at age 11 before realizing otherwise, that's a condemnation of the entire community and is evidence they should be cast out, it's ridiculous, because you know who else is really obsessed with claiming that sexual minorities are pedophiles? You know who else is trying to separate the LGBT community into those who are more oppressed and those who are less oppressed? Those who are in danger of invasion and dilution through this new group that may have some issues, but those issues are secondary to the safety and purity of the in-group? TERFs! It's TERF rhetoric! So much of it is just reworded TERF rhetoric. Listen, exclusionists are not the same as TERFs. A lot of exclusionists were LGBT or trans people, and the optics of calling trans people TERFs are not great. You know who it's okay to call TERFs, though? Actual TERFs. You know what some exclusionists became? Actual TERFs. I have found more than a few blogs that started out as ace discoursers and evolved into full-on TERFs. I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth. They themselves will admit this. Just like I said in my video about Finster and femboys trying to further divide the community because of nebulous concepts of who is the most hurt by oppression and who isn't, is the exact type of infighting that leads to TERFs thriving. Attention, fellow internet queers who live in the United States. You're not being oppressed by other internet people, you are being oppressed by lifelong societal systems and attitudes that don't like any deviations from the norm. It's downright ahistorical to claim otherwise, so if you're gonna try to do so anyway, all you're going to have left is nonsense. The sad thing is that even though it was nonsense that ate away at people's lives for years on both sides. There needs to be a more satisfying justification for something that took up this much mental bandwidth, something that we can understand, atone for, and learn from. To do that, let's take a look at ace discourse in retrospect. So we've explored what ace discourse claimed to be, what it actually was, and how that didn't match up with reality. But there's still the underlying question of why. Why did this culture war spawn the way it did? Why did it make people as angry as it did? Well, I have a theory. For one, looking at all the pictures we've posted as evidence, it's pretty clear that the exclusionist side was not exactly in the best headspace. I mean, I don't think anyone doing ace discourse was in a good headspace, but I can at least understand why an inclusionist would feel shitty when they're the ones being singled out. On the exclusionist side, though, you'll notice a lot of folks feel patronized by being called an allosexual or allo, as if it erases their gay or lesbian identity. My co-writer noticed that there were a lot of lesbians in the discourse, seemingly because at the time, the lesbian flag was not widely acknowledged and the asexual flag was, which likely has more to do with the lesbian flag of the time having questionable origins, while the asexual one has been trucking along since 2009. There was a constant sense of bitterness in these posts. Even if you agreed that asexual people didn't belong, you have to admit that the fury exclusionists had over them was not proportional to the supposed wrongdoings of the community. You might also notice that a lot of these posts specifically took place from 2016 to 2019, with most of these blogs dying off by 2020. I wonder what else was going on in 2016 to 2020. I can't wait to do a thorough investigation of the societal factors that were present in the time frame. Shit, it's Trump. It's fucking Trump, wasn't it? You had a president that was the most openly evil that Tumblr's main user base of 15 to 20-year-olds had ever experienced. You had LGBT rights being rolled back in the US one by one as our people became the most visible we had been in most of our lifetimes. We didn't vote this guy in, most of us weren't even old enough to vote in 2016, and some of us didn't even live in the United States. I remember how soul-crushingly demoralizing the time frame was for everyone, and when you mix that with the existing bitterness and angst of being a teenager, of course it's going to result in cruelty. If you feel powerless to protect yourself in the real world, you're going to need to find some sort of outlet to make you feel like you're protecting yourself or making a change. And since asexuality had just been recognized as part of the community by GLAAD back in 2015, it ended up being in the right place at the wrong time. We can't stop Trump from banning transgenders in the military, but we can stop those evil asexuals from invading our community and taking away what little resources we do have. I should reiterate that not every one of these users were from the US, but given that most of these posts are from a US-centric perspective relative to their politics and frame of history, I do think the majority were at the very least based out of North America. Regardless, the origins just explain why this discourse formed. How it affected people is a whole other issue. I don't want to demonize every single person who fell into the exclusionist side of the issue. Most of these people were teenagers. It was shitty of them to go on bullying campaigns like this, but that shouldn't condemn anyone for life. Please, for the love of God, do not go tracking down or harassing any of the blogs I show here. If you do, I will hit you with my car. How it affected the asexuals caught up in this, though, the group who was also living through an unprecedented and shitty time of US history, but had to deal with their identities being mocked and undermined by their supposed allies on top of that, these are the people who were actually being bullied and silenced. That's what this was all about, right? Taking away these asexual people's so-called influence? Well, at least in this specific online subculture, it worked. People were bullied into silence, and while asexual people have mostly been welcomed into real-life LGBT communities, the after effects of this era and discourse are still felt elsewhere. There are so many stories of asexual people trying to talk about their trauma online and it being minimized, many of which have been chronicled by the blog Millennium Fae of Fuck Yeah Asexual during the height of this discourse. Talking to my asexual friends who were there for this discourse, many were scared into the digital closet and afraid to talk about these things because of how exclusionists would go out of their way to find asexual support networks and actively harass or mock them. Any marginalized person who's used Twitter in the past year would know how toxic and silencing these gleefully bigoted environments can be. And when 2010's Tumblr was full of mean-spirited jokes comparing asexual people to cops, claiming they're just a fandom of people who wish they were oppressed, or outright saying that asexuals are just too ugly to find lovers, it's not hard to see the parallels between it and, say, the recent right-wing mockery of Yasmin Benoit. Speaking of Twitter, you know how people will say that Twitter discourse is usually just 5-year-old reheated Tumblr discourse? No, you have a wife and a kid and a full-time job? Understandable, I'm quite envious. However, while ace discourse isn't exactly a huge thing on LGBT Twitter as far as I'm aware, there is a brand new discourse that I have even less of a frame of reference for understanding now that I'm an adult. Non-binary discourse. Apparently, exclusionist is now a term for lesbians who exclude non-binary people. Stuff like straight lesbian, which I believe refers to bigender or gender fluid people only attracted to women, or bisexual lesbians, which I believe refers to biromantic homosexuals. Identities that even I might not fully understand, but they clearly aren't harming anyone and are just extensions of usual fun gender f***ery. Yeah, that's bad, actually, according to some people. Haven't you heard? Messing with the gender binary is good until it becomes bad again. So, I'm very woke. The cyclical nature of this LGBT gatekeeping, whether it be through transmedicalism, ace-exclusionism, or non-binary exclusionism, is enough to make one think that we should definitely do something about this, right? The people who lived through this have trauma. Today's kids are going through something similar. The fact that pretty much every online LGBT person has seen other online LGBT groups get scrutinized, whether it be asexuals, pansexuals, bisexuals, non-binaries, queers, and so on, is telling. What can we do to fix this? How can these communities get better? How can we make the internet not suck? Step 1. Delete social media. Step 2. Good mood. Okay, seriously, there is way more nuance to this than just the logging off, but I do want to emphasize just how nice it can be to just log off. I recently deleted Twitter off my phone and then also logged out of it on my mobile browsers, and it has genuinely been such a great boon to my mental health. Now when I'm bored on my phone, I'm not mindlessly scrolling through the most putrid and vindictive Twitter takes just to make the clock tick faster. I downloaded NYT Games, the only good part of that godforsaken publication, just so I can have something fun to do when waiting in a line or sitting on the couch. Plus, it's very funny that I pay $6 a month for the crossword archive so I don't feel tempted to use Twitter. It's like reverse Twitter Blue. A whole lot of online discourse would be solved if people simply deleted Twitter or Tumblr and found a hobby. It doesn't even have to be an expensive or tactile hobby. Getting a library card, downloading Libby, and reading a digital book is all free, right there on your smartphone, and it gives you something to read when you're bored that isn't some asshole making a joke that Donald Trump is asexual because they're convinced that asexual people are an existential threat to our community's safety for some reason. Where this solution becomes more nuanced, though, is, the queer aspect. You might have not noticed this, but the United States is pretty explicitly anti-LGBTQ at the moment, and the rest of the world isn't exactly faring any better. Being out isn't an option for everyone. Need I remind y'all of the 4 to 6% conversion therapy rate among LGBT+ teens? So for a lot of people, the only place you truly can be yourself is on the internet. And yet, as it's been demonstrated many times by now, even if you carefully curate your online experience to avoid as much discourse as possible, it's still going to show up because algorithms are designed to spark engagement, and nothing sparks more engagement than discourse. I genuinely don't think ace discourse or non-binary discourse would exist if these teens could simply go to school and be called by the proper name or not bullied for their sexual preferences. They would realize that they have more in common with these other minorities than they do different, and then go play Roblox or something. I don't know what kids do anymore. The last generational trend I hopped onto was Fortnite, and even then I'm like 6 years late to that party. Sadly, we don't live in that hypothetical universe. So, if I had to give one piece of advice to younger folks to potentially stop this pattern from repeating, I'd give one that used to be repeated ad nauseum but has slowly been corroded away from our collective lexicon. Remember that people on the internet are human beings with complexities and traumas and rich textured lives. The human experience cannot easily be summed up into people who have it hard and people who have it easy. Oppression and discrimination are intersectional, and even if someone seemingly has it easy, 1, things aren't always how they appear, as we've explored today, and 2, there's better things to do with your time than finding reasons to exclude people who you think might not have it quite as bad as you. When there's people in power corroborating with each other to do horrible, horrible things, trying to take down individual private citizens is an actual misuse of resources. Ask yourself if the nebulous concept of cishet aces or straight lesbians or some other identity you don't understand is doing even 1% of the tangible, life-ruining harm of a politician trying to ban all medical transition, or a doctor who refuses to properly treat any of his LGBT+ patients. I have my doubts that this video is going to change how online discourse operates. It's dire out there, and I'm just one lady with less than 3K subscribers. But I hated who I was as a teenager. I hated how much I heard these online discourses and spent hours upon hours of my life arguing in them rather than making real-life connections. I didn't actively participate in ace discourse, I was more involved in the Puritan fandom side of bullshit, but I was admittedly way more tolerant of exclusionist ideas than I should have been. What made me realize that I should really speak against them is, well, becoming an adult, going to real-life queer spaces and learning about people's lived experiences, accessing necessary LGBT resources, and seeing that they weren't being gatekept by any sort of mythical cishet ace. Doing the research myself and realizing that there are genuine asexual struggles that the discourse ignores, many of which overlap with LGBT struggles. And even though ace discourse specifically isn't as common anymore, I should really do a video on it to stamp out these ideas altogether in the hopes that this prevents others from falling into future cycles of discourse. The short of it is that I've changed, and I'm still changing, and I'm not perfect, and I never will be. And if I can change, then anyone can. If you're an asexual or non-binary or pansexual exclusionist and watch this video to the end, thank you for hearing me out, and I hope you understand that it's not too late for you to move past these cycles of debate as well. I promise you there are much more important things worth dedicating time to. For example, Roblox. Teenagers still like Roblox, right? Referencing Roblox will make this video connect with the youth so they listen to my thesis. Hit the Gritty, TikTok, Shine, Wednesday, Sephora, iPad, Skibidi Toilet, Puppy Girls, BTS. Oh crap, I forgot forgot, those are my sleeper agent trigger words. Must go to Soviet Union to give transgender people the right to drive again. Goodbye. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and consider donating to my Patreon. For as low as $3 to $5 a month, you can get an amazing set of perks, including early access to new videos, your name listed in the credits, behind-the-scenes blog posts, and an exclusive Discord server. The more support I get, the more time I can dedicate to the channel to make in-depth video essays like these, so be sure to click the link in the description below or go to patreon.com/JennyGeist. Today I'll be giving a shout out to my patrons at the producer tier and above, those being Ace L, Alicia Stella, Arcade Flower 190, Chloe BC, Kira, Joy Content, Oliver Kirkoren, Oski, Sam, Vincent Coates, and Yensid. Even if you can't donate though, liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing are all still immensely helpful to me and it means the world. With that said, I hope you all have a wonderful day and I will see you all later.